Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for today's explainer. If you're the kind of person who loves dissecting great stories and pulling out those hidden gems of wisdom, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to be visually breaking down the narrative, the characters, and some seriously profound lessons hidden inside a classic piece of literature. And even though it was written over a century ago, it feels incredibly relevant to us today. We're diving into Oscar Wilde's brilliantly witty short story, The Remarkable Rocket. So let's jump right in. So, I want you to ask yourself, what happens when your ego gets just a little too big to launch? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we go through today's explainer. Because look, we've all met people who talk a really big game but completely fail to deliver when it actually counts, right? Well, Oscar Wilde took that exact human flaw and spun it into an absolutely unforgettable character. This whole story is basically a masterclass in contrasting blind arrogance with some really harsh reality.
All right, Section 1. Oscar Wilde's explosive tale, an introduction.
Let's set the stage a little bit. The Remarkable Rocket was published way back in 1888, part of a collection called The Happy Prince and Other Tales. Now, on the surface, these might just seem like simple fairy tales, but Wilde meticulously crafted them to convey some deep moral values, specifically serving as a huge warning against pride and arrogance. And the way he pulls off this timeless lesson is through personification. That's just when you take human qualities and emotions, things like sadness, happiness, or in our case today, extreme haughtiness, and you apply them to inanimate objects. By projecting our very human flaws onto something as fleeting as a firework, Wilde gives us a story that's not just really funny, but deeply revealing about human nature. Okay, so our story kicks off with this massive royal rejoicing. The king's son has literally waited a whole year for his bride, a Russian princess who actually arrived in a sledge drawn by 6 reindeer. So to celebrate, they put together this grand schedule of events. First up, a royal banquet lasting a full 5 hours. Then a massive grand ball. And finally, the absolute climax of the evening, a grand display of fireworks scheduled to be let off exactly at midnight. The stakes here are sky high, mostly because the princess has actually never even seen fireworks before. Moving on to Section 2, Meet the Remarkable Rocket. Enter the protagonist. So picture this. The other fireworks, like the squib, the Roman candle, and the Catherine wheel, are just having this nice, polite conversation. Suddenly, they're interrupted by a sharp, dry cough. Enter a tall, arrogant-looking rocket tied to the end of a long stick, who immediately demands perfect silence. And once he has everyone's attention, he declares, "How fortunate it is for the king's son to be married on the very day on which I am to be let off." I mean, wow, right? This perfectly highlights the rocket's immense self-importance. He literally flips reality upside down. In his mind, this massive royal wedding has nothing to do with the prince or the princess. It's literally just a fortunate backdrop for his big moment. The theatrical irony is just incredible. Let's really break this guy down for a second. He brags constantly about coming from these remarkable parents. He claims his mother was the most celebrated Catherine wheel of her day, and his father was this French rocket who flew so high it was called a triumph of pyrotechnic art. But in reality, despite this supposedly noble heritage, his behavior is just unbearable. He's incredibly rude, he constantly demands silence, he belittles the Bengalite, and he gets instantly offended the second the other, way more sensible fireworks point out how selfish he's acting. Section 3, Tears and Damp Powder. The downfall begins. And it's exactly that over-the-top sensitivity that triggers his downfall. The fireworks are all getting ready for the big midnight launch, but the rocket refuses to listen to reason. When the Roman candle and the fire balloons sensibly tell him, hey, keep yourself dry so you can actually perform well, his ego just cannot handle practical advice. He literally manufactures drama, declaring, "I shall weep if I choose," and then bursts into real tears. The text even notes that these tears flowed down like raindrops and nearly drowned 2 little beetles. It's so absurd. He actively chooses to cry over his own imagined importance, just to prove some bizarre point about how deeply sensitive and superior he is. But, as we all know, actions have consequences. Midnight finally strikes, the royal pyrotechnist lights the match, and the grand display begins. The Catherine wheel goes whiz, the Roman candle goes boom, the squibs dance around, the Bengal lights make everything scarlet. The text is packed with these amazing onomatopoeic words. Bang, huzzah!
Literally everyone is a massive success. Everyone, of course, except the remarkable Rocket. Because of his completely manufactured drama, his gunpowder is absolutely soaked with his own tears. He can't go off at all. He proves to be entirely useless. Which brings us to Section 4, Delusion in the Ditch, a Fall from Grace. Now, you would think a massive public failure like that would humble a guy, right? No way. Not our Rocket. The very next day, the workmen come by to tidy up the royal grounds. They spot this damp, useless stick, and they just toss him over the wall. He falls straight into the mud of a ditch. It is a literal and figurative fall from grace. But even as he is quite literally stuck in the mud, he is still wearing this haughty expression. He's approached by a little frog, and then later a dragonfly and a white duck, and he still attempts to act totally superior to the local wildlife, lecturing them about his absolute favorite subject, himself. When this super practical white duck actually asks him what use he is to anyone, the Rocket's response is just astounding. He says, "A person of my position is never useful. We have certain accomplishments, and that is more than sufficient." I mean, come on. Even at his absolute lowest point, literally rotting in a muddy ditch, his ego acts like this impenetrable shield. He has no idea how ridiculous he sounds. He completely reframes his own utter failure as some sort of sign of his elite status. All right, Section 5, an unnoticed grand finale. The final irony. So where does all this delusion finally lead him? Well, after the wildlife abandons him because he's just too insufferable, two young boys come running down the bank with a kettle to boil some water. And the final tragicomic irony hits when one of the boys sees him and says, "Look at this old stick." But the Rocket's ego literally filters reality to protect his fragile self-image. He thinks to himself, "Old stick, impossible. Gold stick, that is what he said. Gold stick is very complimentary." He genuinely convinces himself that the king has sent these boys specifically to retrieve him. So the boys just toss him under their little fire to help boil their kettle, and then they promptly fall asleep. As the Rocket is sitting there slowly drying out in the fire, he finally catches. And once again, those delusions of grandeur take completely over. He cries out, "Now I am going to explode and make such a noise that nobody will talk about anything else for a whole year." He really thinks he is about to become this global sensation. He goes fizz, 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 and shoots straight up into the air in the absolute middle of broad daylight. And guys, here is the absolute ultimate punchline. He certainly did explode, but nobody heard him, not a single person, not even the two little boys, because they were sound asleep. He finally goes off, but it's completely unobserved. All that's left of him is a mere stick, which ends up falling onto the back of a startled goose. He goes out exactly the way he lived, full of hot air, ultimately useless, and completely ignored by a world he truly thought revolved around him. Section 6. The Cost of Arrogance, Lessons Learned. So what does this all mean for us? The beauty of this explainer isn't just in the funny story, but in the really sharp thematic concepts Wilde manages to weave together. Let's do a quick review of the traits that ultimately grounded the Rocket. Vanity and extreme pride. Haughtiness towards everyone around him. Empty talks with absolutely zero action, a severe lack of humility, and a deeply selfish worldview. Oscar Wilde masterfully built a character defined entirely by his flaws. The vocabulary exercises from our source text point out words like arrogant, worthless, and humble to really drive this home. The Rocket had absolutely zero humility, and because of that, despite all his pedigree and potential, he rendered himself totally worthless. There's this perfect handwritten student note in our source material that basically summarizes everything we've just talked about. It reads, "Person full of haughtiness, pride, and empty talks ends up useless and unnoticed." That is exactly it. That is the entire moral wrapped up in one single brilliant sentence. If you spend your whole life talking about how great you are instead of actually doing the work, you are eventually going to fizzle out completely alone. Which brings us to one final, really provocative question taken straight from the text. Do you think the Rocket got what he deserved? I want to leave you with that thought to ponder. Think about it. If he had just listened to the Roman candle, stopped all the dramatic crying, and stayed dry, he could have easily been the star of the royal wedding. But instead, his ego got in the way. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and whatever you do, make sure you keep your gunpowder dry.